everybody. This was like the quickest turnaround in history. We turned it from a workshop space to a stage in 5 minutes.
I'm going to make sure your microphones are where we begin.
Okay. There we go.
Ooh, this one's tricky. You might need to just lift it to your mouth.
It's okay, I'm a bit trippy as well.
So welcome everyone to our next event, which we've called Climate Collapse and Imaginary Worlds. And I'm super, super excited about this one. I should say that when we were programming the Radical Book Fair, Myri and I did have this conversation about how we would try to keep climate crisis as present throughout as many events as possible. Because as we were saying in the workshop earlier, the climate crisis isn't about climate really. It is an intersection of crises, of colonialism, of racism, of oppression in different ways. So we've tried to make that present throughout the entire Radical Book Fair. And the way that we're coming at this event particularly is from the perspective of imagination and of fiction, really, and asking the question, if the climate crisis isn't just about climate, then what does that mean for creativity, and what does it mean for art about climate change? So that's a question for our panelists to answer. It's my huge, huge joy to introduce our authors today. We've got Harry Josephine Giles, and Harry Josephine is from Orkney and lives in Leith. Her first novel, Deep Wheel Orcadia, which is right there, it's a marvelous, marvelous novel, came out with Picador earlier this autumn. She has a PhD in creative writing from Stirling. Her show, Drone, debuted in the Made in Scotland showcase at the 2019 Edinburgh Fringe and toured internationally. So, huge round of applause for Harry Josephine Giles. And then we've got Mark Bould as well. Thank you for coming, Mark. And Mark Bould teaches film and literature at UWE, University of West of England, Bristol. He's co-editor of the journal Science Fiction, Film and Television, and of the book series Studies in Global Science Fiction. So it is a very, very interesting combination. Thank you, Mark, for coming. So the way we're going to do this event is we're going to start off with a question, which I just sprung up on our panelists 5 minutes ago, so they've had about 2 minutes to think about it. And then we'll do a few readings from the books, we'll talk for a bit, and then we'll open up for audience questions towards the end as well. And the question that I wanted to know was, if they could think of a piece of art, or like a piece of art, a film or a book that you encountered a long time ago that at the time you thought this is about climate change. When was the first time that happened? Or as far back as you can remember? Would you like to start?
Yeah. I think this is almost too pat, but I suspect it was probably Greenville, which is a short novel by George Mackay-Brown. And it is about a week in the life of a made-up island in Orkney. And towards the end of the week, which then kind of expands into the future, a international company called Black Star, the Black Star Corporation, starts to take over the island. And it's not explicitly sort of described in the book, but it's a metaphor for the role of oil refineries in Orkney, but also broader than that, a metaphor for ecological, social, and economic, social, and ecological change in the islands and the vast changes that were happening over the course of the 20th century. So it's not a novel in which the word climate change appears, and it's not a novel in which sea levels rise, Orkney floods, but it's a novel in which the mechanisms of climate change and what those mean to island communities, what causes them, how communities are involved and complicit in them, that's what it's about. Yeah. So it's not a climate change novel, but it is.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. What about you, Mark?
Probably, I have kind of two answers. One of them actually was a starting point for thinking about the book was when we saw Tarantino's Hateful Eight and the sort of 70mm roadshow thing, and the indebtedness of that film to John Carpenter's The Thing, and it was actually the long opening sequence of seeing the snow. I thought that landscape means something different 30 odd years later than what that kind of landscape meant for John Carpenter. But I suppose the real answer is also Val Guest's movie The Day the Earth Caught Fire from the early 60s. It's one of a small cycle of British movies where you can tell it's the apocalypse because the weather's improving. There's like Night of the Big Heat is in there as well, and a couple of others. And although in 1962 it couldn't be, I'm very confident that it's 1962. There's a way it couldn't be about climate change, because although the science was kind of there by that point, it hadn't started being gathered together. But of course, the meaning of the film changes over time. So seeing that film in the late 80s, suddenly you're thinking, this is about climate change, this is about the kind of crises we might face. And of course, the reason the Earth's heating up in that film is Russian and American nuclear tests have knocked it off its orbit, so it's plunging towards the sun. And of course, that then does tie in very neatly, it turns out, with thinking about dating the Anthropocene, particularly the great acceleration dating from basically from the 1945 Trinity nuclear test in that period. So it's not directly about climate change when it's made, but clearly it resonates very differently now.
Yeah, yeah. I feel like after this event, people are going to end up with a list of different things to go and look up. So I would absolutely love to hear you read from your books. Would you like to start, Harry Josephine? And if you could just give us a wee introduction as well to the book itself, that would be marvellous.
Will do. Just before I read, can I check, is my volume okay? My voice is a little bit hoarse today, so okay, good. People are nodding, so that seems all right. Thank you. So the book Deep Wheel Orcadia it's a sci-fi verse novel in Orkney language. I usually spend a lot of time explaining that, but I'm just going to throw that out there for you, and you can just cope, because it is also a novel about ecological change in small community. But I suppose the bit of background that you need for this brief scene, this poem, which I'll give to you in the Orkney and in the English, is that the book is set in a space station a few hundred years in the future called Orcadia, which is almost but not entirely unlike contemporary Orkney. And the space station Orcadia, the Deep Wheel Orcadia, which is the name of the space station, the central part of its economy is harvesting and refining these things that I call lights, which I don't really fully explain in the book, kind of deliberately. And lights are, in classic like sci-fi trope style, the kind of fuel for faster than light travel, for interstellar travel. And they operate essentially as a double metaphor for both oil and fish, which are, that have been at different times central pillars of the Orkney economy. All right, so that's the background you need to this, which is a conversation between two characters, Inga and Olaf, who are speaking about the lighting yawl, the boat that they operate for extracting lights, and the problems that they're having as lighters. Inga and Olaf speak business. What like by? She says. She kens fine well what like. Olaf is by for his tea and sits without drinking or speaking. She takes a hand of the wheel. They're thinking I'm working the boat and the crew overhead. He spreads. It's not just about me, for I'm gotten me bairn, and it's just me they're gotten, and Ireland is his third, and Erica's parents no wheel, and Ingrid, does do not think I'm kenning that? We cannot gang out every day. Olaf is fairly gowling. We can and we man, says Inga. What'll thee burn eight? Ireland's? Erica's parent? Is it no creches and nurses when Wiswa burns one work? Is it no common stores when the credits is thin, he snashes, and Inga gets quiet and sad? It is no me, she says. It's Orcadia. The thing kens what's coming. If thou and me talk now, there'll be nothing next year, or after, when the lights is entering, and the shipping, and all we're needing to bide. We're working while we can. Quiet, but hard. Olaf's tea is cold. It is no that bad, he says, but it is. So I'll give that to you in the English so you can follow if you didn't get it in the Orkney. Olaf and Inga talk business. What's going on, friend man boy, she says. She knows perfectly well what's going on. Olaf has come to her for tea and sits without drinking or speaking. She takes charge. You think I'm working the ship and the crew too hard. He starts to burst jumps. It's not just me, because I have my baby and they've only got me, and Erland has had his third, and Erica's parent is sick, and Ingrid, don't you think I know? We can't go out every day. Olaf is really bellow crying. We can and we must, Inga says. Or what will your baby child eat? Or Erland's or Erica's parent? Aren't there creches and nurses when those of us with children have to work? Aren't there common stores when you're short on credits? He snap bites, and Inga grows quiet and sad. It's not just me, she says, it's Orcadia. The council knows what's coming. If you and I take now, there will be nothing next year or later when the lights are rare, unusual, and the shipping and everything we need to wait, stay, live. We're working while we can, quiet but hard. Olaf's tea is cold. It's not that bad, he says, but it is.
Thank you. Oh, that's brilliant. Thank you. Mark, would you like to share a wee bit about your book and from your book?
Not really, that's too hard an act to follow.
They're very different books, and I was
Yes.
just saying earlier that it's so exciting to have a piece of fiction and a piece of non-fiction about fiction alongside each other, so please do.
Yeah, so the Anthropocene Unconscious, what it's an attempt to do is think about contemporary culture and the way the ideas, the anxieties of climate change have infiltrated everything, but without turning to, the kind of Kim Stanley Robinson science fiction or to climate fiction, cli-fi, which is a category I can't stop existing, but I don't find it critically useful. But, so the book itself ranges all over the place. It begins with Sharknado movies and ends with the Fast and Furious movies, but in between we have a lot of contemporary literary fiction, Paul Auster, Carl Evan Nausgaard, Lucy Ellman, Paul Kingsnorth, Arundhati Roy. We also have some comic books in there. There's a section about tree creatures, so we've got Groot and Man-Thing, which is mainly because I wanted to be the first Verso author to get the words giant-sized Man-Thing in a Verso book. It's the title of a Marvel comic from the 70s. So there's quite a lot of playfulness in this, and trying to not say these are the secret hidden meanings of these books, but to try and take an array of texts and say whatever else they're about, these are the ways they're also about climate change. So rather than reading you any of the critical analysis, I'll read you a little bit from the introduction which sets it up. And then because that reaches a kind of depressing point, I'll read you a little bit from the back of the book as well, where hopefully it's a bit more cheerful. And the book kind of exists in between these possibilities. So it begins, imagine the world to come. Imagine carrying on doing too little too late. Imagine we continue to set inadequate emissions targets with no real intention of meeting them, and then keep right on missing them. The parts per million of atmospheric CO2 relentlessly increase. Temperatures rise, releasing the methane naturally sequestered in permafrost and ocean bed clathrates. The last of the glaciers melt. We lose the polar ice caps, first in the north and then inexorably the south. The oceans rise, and since water expands as it warms, rise still more. Low-lying islands disappear. So do the densely populated river deltas. Coastlines retreat. Hundreds of millions flee the inundation. Hundreds of millions more stay behind and die. Elsewhere, deserts form and agriculture collapses. Daytime temperatures kill. Those who can take flight. More refugees, endless border violence to keep them out. Skirmishes, then wars over food and fresh water. Large-scale geoengineering projects distribute climate amelioration here and foreseen but ignored consequences there. Unforeseen consequences fall where they may. More corpses, not just human. The sixth great extinction accelerates, and as each species diminishes, its environment collapses a little more. Death cascades, the planet persists, but we are gone. Imagine a world haunted not just by the dead, but by the spectre of death, drawn ever closer by the already locked-in consequences of our actions and inaction, its domain extended by endless escalating catastrophe. Imagine a future of foreclosed possibilities, haunted by all the worlds that were and all the worlds that could have been. Then imagine, as Amitav Ghosh asks us in The Great Derangement, the most widely read and highly regarded book on literature and climate change, that somewhere in the middle of all this, in a future in which sea level rise has swallowed the Sundarbans and made cities like Kolkata, New York and Bangkok uninhabitable, there are still museums and libraries and bookstores. Picture its inhabitants urgently examining, as Ghosh says, the art and literature of our time for traces and portents of the upheavals that made their substantially altered world. And when they fail to find them, Ghosh asks, what can they do other than to conclude that ours was a time when most forms of art and literature were drawn into the modes of concealment that prevented people from recognizing the realities of their plight? This is, of course, nonsense. It requires us to imagine tidal surges discriminating enough to sweep away significant portions of the science, politics, and science fiction shelves, not to mention all that gussied-up climate fiction too fancy pants to consider itself SF. And it requires us to believe future humans will have really poor reading skills. Because the truth is, auguries abound. The art and literature of our time is pregnant with catastrophe, with water and weather, with wildness and weirdness. Skip to the end. The middle section's really good. So, thanatropic race to destruction, and on the other, a yearning for fullness. In between lies a space in which to imagine the world to come. For decades, that world will be the one sketched in the opening pages of this book: rising seas, creeping deserts, extreme weather, hunger, thirst, migration, wars and violence, depletions and extinctions. We cannot avert or even ameliorate some of the biophysical aspects of this future, but we can change the social, political, and economic systems that organize the distribution of catastrophe and of respite. So recall the worlds we could have had and imagine the ones we could still have. Imagine waking from this anthropogenic nightmare. Imagine possibility. Imagine a world of trees, of all the other lives with which they make kin, of rich and healthy biodiversity. Imagine a world where energy is not just clean but free, where no one lacks water, food, shelter, community, health. Imagine plenitude without profligacy, produced here without creating poverty there. Imagine this red plenty and turn it green. Imagine replacing separation, isolation, hostility and suspicion with a red belonging that says without hesitation or cavil, in Mark Fisher's words, it doesn't matter where you come from or who you are, we will care for you anyway. And imagine extending that unconditional care, that respect and love to the biosphere. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. So many thoughts. So I wanted to start by asking you both about this thing we call science fiction. So one of the things that was going through my head as you were reading through your kind of charting of the years to come Mark, is the relativity of suffering and how every single step means vastly different things depending on who you are and where in the world that you are. And so my first question was about this, how what we call dystopia, and that a lot of climate fiction has kind of revolved around in this part of the world, is based in the future because of that relative suffering, because for most people in this part of the world, climate suffering is in the future. So you've got this kind of binary, like past or present suffering and future suffering. In that binary, for lack of a better word, how does science fiction fit in? Is my question. Does it offer something else, or how do you see it, Harry Josephine?
So a real touchstone for me in thinking through that is a short story collection called Love After the End, which I really recommend, which is an anthology of Indigenous, Two-Spirit, Indigiqueer, LGBTQ2S science fiction. Came out a few years ago. And a central contention of that, but it's called Love After the End. A central contention of that book is that apocalypse is already here and has been here many times in the past, and that Indigenous communities have already survived ecological and social catastrophe and apocalypse. And I think thinking through that flips how we understand the role of science fiction in thinking through climate change, and also, I think, adds a necessary critical distance to how apocalypse has figured in primarily European and European settler science fiction as something that happens in the future. And that, I think, has also, that problem for European and settler science fiction of not recognizing the contemporary existing apocalypses that some communities, many communities, perhaps the majority of communities in the world are already surviving, is baked into science fiction from its inception, or from how we imagine the genre of science fiction, which is from its beginning, it's a genre of European empire, and a genre which replays the anxieties of empire, first contact, invasion, apocalypse, over and over and over and over again, until a point where science fiction is being turned back on itself, reclaimed, subverted by anthologies like Love After the End, by anthologies like So Long Been Dreaming, which is Nalo Hopkinson edited anthology of post-colonial science fiction. So I think science fiction is, as conceived as a genre, and we can also tell other genealogies of what science fiction is, other than that European genealogy, is a genre of kind of denial of the presence of apocalypse, playing out of the anxieties of apocalypse, except when we flip the perspective on it, it then becomes a way of looking at apocalypse that's happening now.
Something fell out. I think we're fine. That's really, really fascinating. What's your sort of take on that, Mark, from the critical side of things?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. One of the tremendous things of the last 20 years has been the emergence in the wake of Afrofuturism, of African futurism, indigenous futurisms, and so on, which start very much from the position that the apocalypse has already happened. And the interaction within what we might think of as mainstream generic white settler science fiction has actually been really quite fascinating, learning lessons going on all over the place about how to actually rethink the present. One of the great things that science fiction does is it historicizes the present moment. By imagining futures, we have to perceive the present as being embedded in history. So science fiction has the capacity to do this really well in really interesting ways, and it's learning how to do that sort of even as we speak. And within that long tradition of settler colonial science fiction, there has been ambiguity and ambivalence and doubt and questioning. Probably the most famous example would be Welles's War of the Worlds from 1897, which its whole premise is that we have this model of progress and development, but what happens when you're an imperial power who suddenly find you're being categorized as undeveloped? by the Martian invaders. And of course that's modelled on the British genocide of Tasmanians explicitly in the opening chapter of the book. But then Wells has this kind of unfortunate element to his thinking as well, that he's very trapped in linear models of evolution. So he thinks of people of colour as actually being people trapped in the past. So there's something complex going on there, and he doesn't get it right, but he's at least doing better than others. And those kinds of ambivalences continue through the 20th and 21st centuries in science fiction. But yeah, I mean, I think the great thing that's going on at the moment is this explosion of, well, we think of them as, they get called alternative futurisms when they're grouped together, but how many of them are actually about struggling with the processes of modernization in very local contexts? And of course, at the core of science fiction in Britain from its origins are working class lads making it into the lower middle classes and turning to science. And that's happening in the US as well, particularly with Jewish American writers in New York in the 20s and 30s. They're outsiders trying to reconcile their communities with these stories of progress and the unfolding of modernity around them. So, there is so much in there as potential.
That's absolutely fascinating. And you mentioned, local communities there and the impact of change, modernization, but other kinds of change as well on local communities. Which brings me to something I wanted to ask you, Harry Josephine, about in Deep Wheel Orcadia. Obviously, the threat of change and the anxiety of change is a huge presence throughout the entire book. And you were talking earlier about the light and about the metaphor of the light. I wondered how your thinking sort of progressed throughout writing the book and how specific you wanted or didn't want to be in terms of what these things meant and how specific you wanted the threat to be. I'm just really curious to hear about your kind of thought process around that.
Yeah, I mean, I have a pretty fully worked out, hard science fiction explanation for everything that happens in the book. Like, I have a story. I have a, and it's not like Alistair Reynolds style, like, I am going to tell you every single technical aspect of what's going on. But I have, a pretty good idea of what's going on, and then I just didn't put it in. I put nearly none of it in the book. I just let what happens. The light in this book, it's on the one hand a metaphor for Orkney's role in extraction economies that drive ecological collapse, that now we're a petrochemical economy. Our biggest industries are oil refining, tourism, particularly cruise ship tourism, and farming, all of which are dependent on oil, all of which are completely dependent on oil. Like, we're an oil-dependent economy. And prior to that, we were a fishing and farming economy until ecological collapse took most of the fishing away, right? So that's what Orkney is, and that's my childhood. That's what I grew up in. I grew up in a community that is surviving ecological collapse in a very, in its own particular way and its own meanings in that, and it's also driving ecological collapse in its own particular ways and its own meaning in that. So light is in one sense a metaphor for that, and in another sense it is, towards the end of a book, a metaphor for revenge and the revenge of the past, because I've got some stuff going on with faster than light travel and temporal paradox that light then also figures as a metaphor for. And there's a sort of fantasy of reckoning in the book as well, which is more of a fantasy, I suppose. So I have some specific stuff, but I suppose in the book it mostly functions at a metaphorical level.
Yeah, well, that's a lot of specific stuff, which is sort of suspected. And so I'm then just curious about that decision. Like, what drove you to go, actually, no, I'm not going to put any of this in. I'm going to leave it at that and let the reader do part of the work.
Well, it's partly my editor's fault.
Okay.
So if you want some more of it, there is that my thesis is available. You can request it, and an earlier version of the book, an earlier version of the book has I mean, I will release it at some point. There's a framing narrative that actually like explains all of the metaphors.
Oh, wow.
And then Don was like, no, you've got to get rid of that. This is your book's great, but you have to cut all of that. And I ummed and ahed like for a year, and I was like, no, but it's really clever. And then he was like, no, you have to get rid of it. I was like, okay, I'll get rid of it. So it's partly my editor's fault, but it's also, you know, when you, Don described it as scaffolding, and it was scaffolding, that stuff is scaffolding for a bunch of metaphors, and when you cut the scaffolding away, then a work of literature can then function more multivalently. It can, I mean, I've just told you a bunch of things that it means, and if you haven't read the book already, now I've like ruined it for you, because it only means one thing. But if you don't know all of that, then you get to take away all sorts of other meanings from it, because that way it can mean, that's a very writerly answer, but it's the truth.
No, but that is really, really fascinating.
Yeah.
And I was thinking as well in terms of community, Mark, I was really interested to hear in your, you know, in your book, there's all sorts of places and environments that are threatened by collapse. I wondered if throughout your writing of the book and throughout your studying of this, what was the importance of like communities, but interpersonal relationships in communities? Like, did you find much about that? I guess climate anxiety in communities.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of sort of sociological research and psychological research on the effects of extreme weather catastrophes and things like that. But I think one of the things, actually one of the hardest things with the book was needing to use the word we. Because, you know, obviously there are massive disparities of responsibility going on when we use the word we to talk about. And who is this community I'm evoking? And, you know, can I be the voice talking to or for this community? Because, you know, there's a long list of acknowledgements of the book. I know from writing before that writing books feel very personal. You're sat in front of a computer swearing a lot. But this book is actually the product of conversations with people and of wanting to explore ideas. And through a lot of the fiction that we look at, there are communities. There's the kind of standard American narrative of reconstituting a broken family in the Sharknado movies. And so these 6 movies about disasters that time travel back to before the Katy extinction event into 23,000 and something in the future. All of that over 6 movies is about fixing 2 broken families. And the way that the family operates as an atom of community is really interesting. The Fast and Furious movies, for all that they're, you know, right in the heart of the petrocultural beast, they cannot imagine a non-carbon world. There's all kinds of things they can't imagine. But what's at the core of the movies is this sense of family that combines some blood relations, but are mostly families of choice. They're kith rather than kin, if you like. And that it's a multi-ethnic, mostly working class community. There's something profoundly utopian at the core of those movies. And then, you know, when we look at Arundhati Roy's fiction or Paul Kingsnorth fictions, these are about communities being destroyed, communities being torn apart, and thinking about how the mechanisms of catastrophe unfold. And in neither case are they explicitly climate change catastrophes, but they are also tied to climate and tied to changing land use and militarization and things like that. So, yeah, it was. I'm glad I found a way to find hope in these texts, because it is quite depressing thinking about climate change all the time.
Yeah, and I mean, the word that comes up for me when you're talking is resilience as well, that these are stories that kind of start to touch on that, which you don't really have if you're constantly looking at fear and constantly looking at the future.
Yeah, so the kind of inspiration of trees and fungi run deep through the book as well. So one of the, probably the only book I don't say anything nasty about in my book is Richard Powers' The Overstory, because of the way it exposes the falsity of us imagining trees as individuals. There's even a little bit in the novel where someone's wondering whether a way to save the environment is to give trees individual rights, roughly equivalent to human rights. And of course, no, you don't have trees, you have forests. The organism is the forest, not the individual tree. And that's a really useful way for thinking about people and human relationships as well.
Absolutely, for sure. I know that you talk a lot about language in events about this book, Harry Josephine, but I'm still going to ask you about language, and I think it ties into both of your books. So obviously the role of the Orkney is incredibly important in Deep Wheel Orcadia, and the way I kept thinking about it was, you know, the act of writing, and we were just talking about this earlier, like the act of writing in, I suppose, a minority language, in the context of ecological collapse. So I wondered how, when writing the book, you saw the Orkney dialect as part of an ecosystem, and what type of ecosystem is that?
Ooh.
Yeah, sorry.
Yeah, I mean, we can, you know, there's the basic parallel, which is that language in these islands is a monoculture. That English, as a mechanism of empire, and English as a language is formed through empire, as is French, as is Spanish. That they are formed by the active suppression of internal variations, and then by the active suppression of external languages as well, to the point where we live in these islands that are constructed as monoglot, and in which their monolingualism is forcibly and violently maintained through the education system, through culture, and that's as agricultural monoculture is I don't want to say unnatural, but it's not how the majority of people work. It's not how the human brain is set up to work. I don't think we have brains that are fantastically skilled at multilingualism, and I think that the monoculture of language operates like agricultural monoculture as a means of it's a tool of empire. It's a tool of ecological destruction, insofar as language is an ecosystem, and they're connected because monolingualism and language supremacy is one of the central tools of white supremacist empire, which is one of the central drivers of climate collapse and ecological collapse. I'm not going to go so far as to say that like working in minority languages within a white context can do much to disrupt any of that, but I suppose what's important to me is working in the position that I'm working in, poking at monolingualism, asking for thinking about language a different way from my home and from the position that I work in, starts to pick at some of this stuff and starts to highlight some of that stuff.
Yeah, and it shifts the reader's position, and it shifts the reader's kind of consciousness of being multilingual or monolingual. Absolutely.
I love, one of the things I love about the book, which is fabulous, and buy that one, is as you're reading the Orkney dialect, you're very conscious of a translation process of the words you can understand, the words you can't understand, whether you're going to cheat and read the English text at the bottom, or what have you. And then the English text itself isn't straightforward English either. And lovely use of sort of composite words where you're given 3 words joined together, which kind of create a sense of precision, then also create ambiguity because you're not sure of the relationship between those words and the words at the top. It changes consciousness as you're reading it. It's
absolutely
brilliant.
And you mentioned in your book, Mark, there's a bit where you're talking about Paul Kingsnorth's book, The Wake, and how it uses this sort of reconstructed Old English, which really made me wonder, what role did you see language as having in that moment of apocalypse, or that moment of complete breakage with everything that people have known before?
That's a tough question. There are several texts I talk about with language as well. So I was talking about Denis Villeneuve's Arrival, where the aliens come Amy Adams learns their language, and it changes her consciousness, and she begins to perceive time differently. And I think in the time of catastrophe, communication across difference is absolutely essential, because there's not going to be some saviour figure, there's not going to be a technocratic solution to it, there's not going to be one solution to this. The thing, I mean, obviously get rid of capitalism is the solution, but you don't do that in one go. And you don't then necessarily guarantee everything else is going to fall into place afterwards. But what will make changes, and the scale of changes from the way a lot of the corporate discourse tries to put this onto individual responsibility, is you scaling between individuals and communities, cities, regions, countries, larger blocks of transformation. And that's absolutely an essential role in that is language and communication. That's absolutely terrifying, like a Dalek was sneaking up on me or something.
Is that better?
Is that okay? Yeah?
I think it might be the mic, actually.
I could just talk
Sorry,
louder.
folks. I mean, I can hear you really well, so I wasn't aware. Can you?
Take your eye out.
Is that better? Is that better?
Oh,
yes.
yes.
Oh, I can hear it now. Thank you.
Yeah.
What did I say?
The good thing is as well that everything will have been recorded, so you can also watch the live stream afterwards because you've got another mic. So
Yeah.
that's all good. But about the language.
Yeah, so the communication and the ways in which communication across difference forms communities, and that then becomes a way of producing solutions that scale down to individual responsibility and upwards through communities to larger groupings. Because there was a report, I was going to say there's a depressing report came out during COP26, and which one?
Yeah.
It was of a survey done of people from 10 European nations who asking about their responses. And there was this really curious thing going on where people were saying if it was something they were already doing that had good consequences, they felt they were doing enough. But if it was something that required a massive transformation, what would felt to be a massive transformation for themselves, they were not interested in it. So it seems all of middle-class Europe is really happy recycling but can't imagine giving up cars.
Yeah.
And obviously, no one actually needs a car. No one actually needs to own a car. Most cars sit there unused for like 95, 97% of their lifetime. So how do you persuade people to get rid of cars? And that's where the conversations across difference have to happen. That's where a bigger imagination of what the world transformed without private cars would be like. Obviously, you start at the top end and get rid of SUVs and luxury vehicles and private jets and private yachts just to annoy rich people, but also disproportionate carbon footprint. But how do you get your local community to abandon their cars? You have to have the conversations about fast, free, efficient public transport, about slowing down life, about transforming these streets which are currently, the width of 2 cars and 2 parked cars, transforming them into gardens. You only need one route through there. You don't need roads like this. But these kinds of ideas come from conversation, come from talking in communities, and come from changing consciousness. And so much of that is about language, and not me coming in with my vision of getting rid of cars, but talking about how my local community, my city, other cities can transform what they are and become greener, cleaner, healthier spaces.
And I suppose ownership of language as well, because if someone comes from with a lot of privilege and tells you things in using that language, and as we were talking about in terms of colonial languages especially, that makes a huge difference, doesn't it?
Yeah,
For sure,
absolutely.
yeah.
We learn, from the people who've already survived the apocalypse, which means we learn from people whose countries this one invaded and devastated.
I have loads of questions, but I'm also very aware that we have a set time for an event. So I'm going to open it up for questions from the audience, and we have someone with a roaming mic. Is it Myri? Yes, it is Myri. So please do raise your hands if you've been sitting on a question or if something pops up. We have somebody in red right there.
It will be easier.
Yeah.
That happened to me yesterday. We have to, I just realised I forgot to say that we have to repeat the questions as well, because otherwise they won't end up on the live stream. So forgive me if I condense a wee bit. So that was the question for Harry Josephine about fiction in terms of the balance between accessibility and metaphor. Yes?
Yeah, so the first half of the question was that I'd mentioned releasing something that had all the metaphors explained. And then it opened out into a question of like, what is the role of I suppose, making literature accessible? How do you do like the consciousness transforming work of literature, working in a very niche area or working in an obscure area? They're good questions. To clarify what's being released, so this book was actually written as during my PhD thesis, and there's a whole theory section. So the thesis is like half this book or a draft of this book and half a bunch of theory. And it's, I can't make it purely accessible now because I'm publishing a book, but like if you request it or you message me, I'll send it to anyone, and then at some point it will all be like publicly online. I'm probably never going to be an academic, so I'm probably never going to work that thesis up into an academic book, but bits of it will be published in various forms. So that's, just to be clear, that's what I meant by that. And the broader question, I mean, I've written an Orkney language science fiction verse novel, so clearly I'm not like hugely invested in mass market literature. On the other hand, like I did pursue publication with a big five, like it's published with a big five publisher. It's published with a very big publisher, and that is enabling it to reach far more people than I had ever thought possible for this book. And that is slightly shifting my perspective on what it's actually possible to do with a book. And it turns out that you can actually do something really weird, and if the marketing is right and you put some like economic clout behind it with all of the like compromises and complicities that entails, then you can find some more readers with it and have some more conversations about it. I remain like both awed and delighted and also skeptical of that. Like there is no working at scale in culture that is not, I mean, there is no working in culture that is not part of like extremely violent capitalist systems. You can't work in literature without working in a violent system. Like you can't. Literature is a system of maintaining class privilege, and all of that entails. That's what literature is primarily for. So, as is every cultural and entertainment industry, I'm deeply, deeply skeptical of the idea that culture, whether it's mass culture or minority culture, can have a leading role in any kind of political change. Like, that's not where I'm at. That said, I think any book has to speak to, I don't know. I suppose I'm more interested in the kind of communities that can be created around a book, or the kind of specific and local communities that a book can speak from and to, than working on trying to transform things with a book on a large scale. I don't know, ask me in 2 weeks. I'm going home to do the Orkney launch in 2 weeks, and I have no idea what those conversations are going to be like. I have a very inside-outside perspective on my home, and that's going to be a whole different thing.
That will be fascinating.
Yeah.
Any
Is
other
there another one?
questions?
Did I see a hand back here? We now also have a second, like a microphone for the live stream, so it doesn't need to be repeated now. Aha.
Oh, that's cool.
Yeah. I might need you to come to me.
That would be exciting. Sorry. Oh, I can stand in the centre. Mark, I just want to thank you both for great talks. Mark, can I just ask you about the apocalypse more generally? Because science fiction, you know, in the 60s and before, I'm thinking of books like Ridley Walker, to come back to language, and Canticle for Leibowitz, where it's the atomic apocalypse and this kind of looking back. And to what extent does what you call climate science fiction look back towards that apocalyptic tradition, more homely, nuclear and atomic, and how those things are connected?
The strand of apocalypticism in science fiction is there from the roots. So we historicise the science fiction from the Great Acceleration moment, that sort of 50s concern with nuclear war, and see that as itself building on traditions that would include things like planetary impacts, geological upheavals, volcanic eruptions, strange gases being released from the North Pole that wipe out all of life on Earth apart from one madman who wanders around the ruins of Europe. All sorts of apocalyptic currents are there that at that moment in time, I think what's really interesting about that moment in time is the apocalypse is very, very strongly figured in terms of nuclear war. At the same time, some science fiction writers are also thinking about the turn to the acceleration of commodity culture in that period. So a writer like Frederick Pohl finds the apocalypse in everybody owning plastic things. Or you look at something like Bradbury's Fahrenheit 451, which does end with a nuclear strike, but in between, it's all about plastic-coated houses, burning gasoline to burn books. There's a long sequence with a car trying to cross a busy road with cars whizzing around it, and the joyriders take it upon themselves to try and run down people. So when we get this kind of saturation of apocalypse there, so I think a figure like J.G. Ballard's really interested with his first 4 novels, though obviously he kind of suppressed the first one. So The Drowned World, very obviously, it's not about climate change. He does actually leave the explanation in there. It's solar flares that caused it. The drought is then the one for me that's most interesting, because the world dries up because water is being captured inside plastic. And so you can't actually use water any longer. And that seems to me a very intense imagistic metaphor for recognizing already at that time that somehow petroculture is responsible as an apocalyptic moment. And then the other big crossover would be the opening historical montage at the start of Mad Max 2 Road Warrior, where we get the oil wars, which become a nuclear explosion. What's really curious about climate change fiction, though, is the ways in which nuclear catastrophe do thread through it. So something like World War Z, Max Brooks's novel, rather than the film version, where zombies are clearly a metaphor for climate refugees, and also they're being pursued, they are pursuing refugees who are being pursued by these metaphors of climate change. One of the things that happens there is oil fields burning and nuclear exchanges going on. So if you think about the heightened tensions of the world, Arrival does this as well, in that it can't use the appearance of aliens as anything more than a metaphor, a very watery metaphor for an epochal change in history, but its geopolitical imagination is hilarious. And because America's the level-headed one who's really reluctant to use armed force at any stage. you know, like in the real world. But so we get this really curious thing going on there where, you know, a pretty smart film can think through on some level a metaphor for climate change, but can't think past the present moment of that view of the world. So it's unconsciously showing us where how catastrophe will play out in current geopolitical systems. Sorry, that's a very long, rambly answer.
It was really fascinating, though. I think we've got. Do we have time for one more?
A very, very brief one, just because we have a tiny window between the two events.
If you have a very brief question,
Right.
then please.
There we go. And then brief answers, my lovely.
Right. I'll keep it brief. Thank you very much both for your talks. They were fascinating. But you were talking about re-greening of cities, which was a process and an approach that has been underway for a time, but has been accelerated by COVID. Do either of you see, in a very short way, how that sort of the COVID sort of shock to the Western psyche might actually result in more positive science fiction?
No. What we've seen out of, I mean, we're not out of COVID. Like, what we've seen in the last year particularly is like the most horrifically violent attempt to return Western, for want of a better word, societies to normal as possible, with all of the ecological and human damage that entails, the level of like suppression and denial that is currently going on, and the forcible forgetting of everything that was being talked about in the early months of COVID is terrifying and enraging. So no, it has not made me remotely hopeful.
Mostly that, but with a very, very tiny little bit of hope for, you know, just from my own experience, right at the start of COVID, 2 people at the top of our street put a message to every door: if you need help, call us. And they're still there.
Yeah,
That doesn't save the
systems
world,
and its people,
but it
isn't
saves
Yeah.
some things.
Thank you so much. It was so weird to end on that note. But I mean, it's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much. A huge round of applause for our panel. And I should say that you can get your book signed by our